"Shall we go ruin a wedding, darling?" I whispered against the shell of her ear. For a terrifying suspended second, the entire world ceased to exist. There was only the blinding heat of the camera flashes against my closed eyelids, the heavy scent of crushed bergamot and ozone, and the rigid, frozen posture of Camilla Vance pressed flush against my silk-clad body. I had just branded the Ice Queen of Wall Street, right in front of her father, right in front of her fiancé, right in front of the entire elite world. I pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. I fully expected anger. I expected her to shove me away, to break the illusion, to fire me on the spot for going so wildly off script. But what I saw in those glacial blue depths was something entirely different. The shock was there, yes, but beneath it was a sudden, roaring wave of pure adrenaline. Camilla Vance was suffocating in her velvet cage, and I had just handed her a sledgehammer. Her breath hitched, her eyes dropping to my crimson-stained lips before darting back to mine. Then, the billionaire heiress did something that completely caught me off guard. Instead of stepping back, Camilla's hand, the one resting hesitantly on my waist, suddenly clamped down. Her long fingers gripped the delicate burgundy silk with an almost bruising, possessive force, pulling me back against her pristine white tuxedo. "You are absolutely insane." Camilla breathed, her voice a low, raspy vibration that sent a violent shiver down my spine. "You bought my absolute obedience, Miss Vance," I murmured back, maintaining a flawless, intoxicating smile for the cameras. "You never specified how I should apply it." With a sudden, commanding grace, Camilla turned us both toward the swarm of reporters. She didn't wipe the scandalous red lipstick mark off her neck. She wore it like a badge of honor, like a war declaration. Miss Vance, over here!" a reporter screamed over the barricade, practically climbing over a security guard. "Who is your guest? Is this an official confirmation?" "What about Julian Croft? We were told tonight was an engagement announcement," another yelled, shoving a microphone toward us. Camilla's posture was magnificent. She stood tall, projecting that terrifying, untouchable aura that made her family an empire. But this time, her other hand reached down, intertwining her fingers perfectly with mine. Her grip was ironclad, a silent anchor in the hurricane. "My guest," Camilla said, her voice cutting through the noise like a polished diamond blade. It was smooth, cold, and entirely unbothered. "Is Nadia. And as for Julian Croft..." She paused, letting the silence stretch, mastering the chaotic energy of the crowd effortlessly. She turned her head slightly, offering me a look of such intense, manufactured devotion that for a split second, even my own heart skipped a beat. "Julian is a business associate of my father," Camilla finished, her eyes still locked on mine. "Nothing more. I think my current priorities are quite clear. The paparazzi absolutely lost their minds." We moved up the grand, red-carpeted stairs of the Metropolitan Museum. Every step we took was synchronized, the deep red silk of my gown brushing against her immaculate white trousers. The air around us felt thick, charged with electricity. But as we reached the top of the stairs, the chaotic noise of the press faded, replaced by the suffocating, heavy silence of the elite. Standing right at the entrance of the gala were Richard Vance and Julian Croft. Richard Vance looked exactly like a man who was used to owning everything he looked at. He had silver hair swept back perfectly, a sharp, hawk-like nose, and eyes that were the exact same terrifying blue as his daughter's. But while Camilla's eyes held a hidden, fractured depth, his were just empty, freezing voids. Beside him, Julian Croft was practically vibrating with rage. He was handsome in that generic, overly groomed, old-money way. His bespoke tuxedo was impeccable, but his face was flushed an ugly, mottled red. Camilla's grip on my hand tightened so painfully I almost winced. The Ice Queen mask was flawlessly in place, but I could feel the microscopic tremor in her fingers. She was terrified. I gently swept my thumb over the back of her hand, a silent, grounding rhythm. "I've got you. Let them choke on it." "Camilla," Richard Vance said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying gravity that made the surrounding guests instinctively step back. His eyes flicked to me, taking in my dress, my face, and settling furiously on the red lipstick mark branding his daughter's neck. What is the meaning of this spectacle? Good evening, Father, Camilla replied smoothly, stepping slightly in front of me, a protective, shielding gesture that she executed entirely unconsciously. I believe I am simply arriving at your gala. With my partner... Julian scoffed loudly, stepping forward. He looked at me the way one might look at an insect that had crawled onto a dining table. Partner? Camilla, don't be ridiculous. Who is this woman? Another one of your little rebellious phases designed to embarrass the board? He reached out, as if to grab Camilla's arm and physically pull her away from me. Before Richard Vance or Camilla could react, I moved. I stepped smoothly out from behind Camilla's shoulder, interposing myself between her and Julian. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't break my composed, sweet smile. I just looked him up and down with an expression of profound, devastating pity. Julian, isn't it? I asked, my voice a soft, melodic purr that carried perfectly in the quiet tension of the foyer. He stopped, his hand dropping, thrown off by my absolute lack of intimidation. Who the hell are you? I'm the woman who just saved you from a lifetime of profound disappointment, I said, tilting my head slightly. I used the exact same psychological tactics I used in The Obsidian, finding the absolute core of a man's insecurity and pressing on it like a bruise. Because let's be honest, darling, look at her. I gestured to Camilla, who was watching me with wide, completely mesmerized eyes. She is a Vance. She is an empire. I continued, my voice dropping lower, dripping with dark honey and lethal condescension. And you? You are a poorly tailored suit holding a trust fund you didn't earn. You couldn't handle her on your best day. So please, stop embarrassing yourself in front of the cameras. It's ruining the ambiance. Julian's mouth opened and closed. He looked completely, utterly destroyed. No one in this echo chamber of wealth had ever spoken to him like that. He looked at Richard Vance for support, but the older man was staring at me with a new, dangerous calculation in his eyes. Enough, Richard finally snapped, though his voice was tightly controlled. This is a public space. We will discuss this arrangement privately, in my office, in 10 minutes. He turned on his heel, his security detail immediately parting the crowd for him. Julian shot me one last venomous glare before scurrying after him like a kicked dog. The moment they were out of sight, the suffocating pressure of the encounter seemed to crash down on Camilla all at once. Her immaculate posture didn't falter, but her skin went frighteningly pale. The powder room, Camilla ordered, her voice incredibly tight. Now. We moved quickly through the opulent halls of the museum. The gala was in full swing, string quartets playing over the low hum of well-fit conversation. Every head turned as we passed. They whispered behind crystal champagne flutes, their eyes glued to the towering billionaire in white, and the woman in the red dress walking by her side. Camilla pushed open the heavy oak doors of the VIP powder room in the east wing. The moment the door clicked shut, locking us in the marble and gold-plated sanctuary, the billionaire completely collapsed. Not physically, but emotionally. She dropped my hand, walking over to the massive marble sink. She gripped the edges so hard her knuckles turned white, bowing her head as she took in ragged, desperate breaths. The adrenaline of the red carpet was evaporating, leaving behind the crushing, terrifying reality of what she had just done. She had declared war on her father. She had burned her bridges. I stood by the door, giving her the space she desperately needed. I watched the sharp line of her shoulders rise and fall under the white tuxedo jacket. "You went off script," she finally rasped, staring at her reflection in the gilded mirror. "The script was failing, Camilla," I replied softly, walking slowly toward her, the silk of my dress whispering against the marble floor. "Your father was going to announce the engagement the second you walked in. You were freezing," I improvised. "You kissed me," she said, finally lifting her head to look at me in the mirror. The glacial blue of her eyes was turbulent, a storm of panic on something else, something hot and entirely consuming. "In front of 400 cameras." "I claimed you," I corrected, stopping right behind her. Our reflections stood side by side. The contrast of my dark hair and red dress against her pale blonde hair and white suit was striking. "I made sure every single person in that room knew exactly who you belonged to tonight. It was the only way to stop the announcement." Camilla turned around to face me. The space between us was non-existent. The air in the private bathroom was thick, heavy with the scent of expensive perfume and raw electric tension. Slowly, almost hesitantly, Camilla raised her trembling hand. Her fingers brushed against the side of her own neck, tracing the outline of the bright red lipstick mark I had left just beneath her jawline. "You marked me," she whispered, the arrogance completely gone, replaced by a devastating, raw vulnerability. She wasn't angry. She was utterly, terrifyingly captivated. "I did," I murmured, my gaze dropping to her lips. The silence that followed was deafening. The contract, the money, the fake relationship. It was all dissolving in the heavy, heated air between us. Camilla's chest was heaving, and she leaned forward, completely unconsciously, drawn to me by a gravitational pull neither of us could control. But just as the space between us disappeared, a sharp, heavy knock echoed against the oak door. "Miss Vance!" A deep, imposing voice called from the other side. "Your father is waiting in the private study now." "Miss Vance?" The deep, imposing voice called again from the other side of the door. "Your father is waiting in the private study now." The spell was broken instantly. The intoxicating, heavy air in the powder room vanished, sucked out into the cold reality of the Vance empire. Camilla flinched, her eyes snapping shut for a fraction of a second. When she opened them again, the raw, devastating vulnerability that had just drawn us together was entirely gone. The Ice Queen was back. She straightened her posture, adjusting the lapels of her pristine white tuxedo, pulling the armor tight around her ribcage. She didn't look at the mirror, she didn't look at the bright red lipstick mark still branded on her neck, and she didn't look at me. "Stay behind me," Camilla ordered, her voice completely stripped of emotion. It was a command, not a request. "Do not speak unless spoken to. Richard Vance is not a man you play psychological games with, Nadia. He will destroy you without blinking." "I grew up around men who break fingers for a living, Camilla," I replied smoothly, smoothing down the deep burgundy silk of my gown. I walked toward the door, my heels clicking sharply against the marble. "Your father just wears a better suit. Let's go." We were escorted by two massive Madden earpieces through the labyrinthine back halls of the Metropolitan Museum. The air grew colder, the opulent lighting of the gala replaced by stark, functional fluorescence. This was the hidden machinery behind the beautiful illusion, the perfect metaphor for Camilla's life. The private study was located at the end of a long, shadowed hallway. The bodyguard opened the door without knocking, stepping aside to let us in. The room was suffocating. It smelled of old paper, expensive leather, and the sharp, bitter tang of cigar smoke. The only light came from a green glass banker's lamp on a massive mahogany desk. Sitting behind that desk, perfectly still in the shadows, was Richard Vance. Julian Croft was nowhere to be seen. This was a family execution, and Richard preferred to handle his messes privately. Camilla walked to the center of the room, her posture flawlessly rigid. I stood half a step behind her right shoulder, the devoted partner, the silent threat. "Sit," Richard commanded, gesturing to the two leather chairs in front of his desk. He didn't raise his voice. Men with that much power never needed to yell. The world simply quieted down to listen to them. "I prefer to stand," Camilla replied, her voice freezing the air in the room. "Make this quick, Father. My guests are waiting." Richard leaned forward, the light from the lamp catching the harsh, unforgiving lines of his face. His eyes, that terrifying empty blue, flicked past Camilla and landed squarely on me. He didn't see a woman. He saw a variable in an equation he was trying to solve. "I have spent the last 25 years building you into the perfect successor," Richard began, his tone almost conversational, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "I have shielded you from scandals, educated you, and arranged a merger that will secure the Vance legacy for the next century. And you attempt to burn it down by parading a distraction in front of my board members." "I am not marrying Julian," Camilla stated, her jaw clenched tight. "He is incompetent, he is weak, and the Croft holdings are heavily over-leveraged. It's a bad deal, and beyond the business, I loathe them." "Marriage isn't about affection, Camilla. It's about acquisition," Richard snapped coldly. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek silver checkbook. He set it on the mahogany desk. "Now, let us deal with the immediate problem." He finally addressed me directly. "I don't know where my daughter found you, and frankly, I don't care," Richard said, picking up a gold fountain pen. "I assume you are an actress, or perhaps something slightly more transactional. You played your part beautifully on the carpet. You caused the necessary shock value. Now, the performance is over." He scribbled a number on the check, tore it precisely from the book, and slid it across the polished wood. "There are 6 zeros on that piece of paper," Richard stated, his eyes boring into mine. "You will take it. You will walk out the back door of this museum. You will sign a non-disclosure agreement my lawyers will provide in the morning, and you will never speak to or look at my daughter again. If you refuse, I assure you, whatever life you have built in this city will be dismantled by sunrise." Camilla's entire body went rigid. I could see the microscopic tremor return to her hands. She was waiting for me to take it. She was waiting for the inevitable betrayal, because in her world, everyone had a price. That was the core of her trauma, the absolute certainty that love could always be bought out. I didn't look at the check. I didn't even blink. Instead, I stepped out from behind Camilla's shadow, walking slowly up to the edge of the mahogany desk. I rested my hands on the polished wood, leaning down slightly so I was eye level with the billionaire patriarch. I let my gaze slowly trail over his face, utilizing every psychological trick I had learned in the underground VIP rooms. I didn't look at his wealth. I looked at his fear. And beneath the arrogance, Richard Vance was terrified of losing his grip on his empire. "Mr. Vance," I began, my voice a soft, dangerously melodic purr that completely contrasted with the hostility in the room. "It is a very generous offer. It truly is." I saw Camilla's shoulders drop a fraction of an inch, a silent, agonizing defeat. "But you seem to be operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation," I continued, my eyes locking on Richard's. I reached out, my manicured fingers lightly brushing the edge of the check, before slowly, deliberately pushing it back across the desk toward him. "I am not a variable you can buy out of an equation," I whispered, the edge in my voice sharpening into a blade. "I am the woman who holds your daughter's heart. And unlike you, I look at Camilla and see a masterpiece, not a merger. You think you can throw money at this because money is the only language you speak. But the connection I have with her?" I stood up straight, offering him a smile that was completely devoid of warmth. "That is entirely priceless. Keep your 6 zeros, Richard. They won't buy you back the control you lost tonight." The silence in the study was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a detonation. Richard Vance's face turned a terrifying shade of pale. No one, absolutely no one, spoke to him with such blatant, condescending disrespect. The pen in his hand snapped with a sharp crack, but before he could unleash the full fury of his power, Camilla moved. She stepped up beside me, the white of her tuxedo a stark contrast to the shadows of the room. She reached out and took my hand, intertwining our fingers. Her grip was no longer trembling. It was solid. It was a choice. "We are leaving," Camilla said to her father. Her voice was no longer the frozen, defensive tone of the Ice Queen. It was the authoritative, commanding voice of a woman who had just realized she was holding the keys to her own cage. "The engagement is permanently off. If you attempt to force it, I will take my shares to the board and initiate a hostile takeover. Do not test me, father. You taught me everything I know about ruthless acquisitions. I suggest you don't make me use it against you." Without waiting for his response, Camilla turned on her heel, pulling me with her toward the heavy oak doors. "If you walk out that door, Camilla," Richard's voice echoed behind us, venomous and desperate, "you are completely on your own." Camilla didn't even pause. I always have been. We didn't go back to the gala. We walked straight through the service corridors, bypassing the paparazzi, and slipped out the loading dock entrance where the Maybach was already waiting, idling in the cold, misty rain. The moment the heavy, bulletproof doors of the car sealed us inside, the adrenaline crashed. It was immediate and devastating. Camilla collapsed against the plush leather seat, her pristine posture completely disintegrating. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as she dragged in ragged, oxygen-starved breaths. She had just detonated a nuclear bomb in the center of her life. I didn't say a word. The air in the cabin was too fragile for words. I slid across the leather seat, closing the distance between us. I gently reached out, pulling her trembling hands away from her face. She looked at me, her glacial blue eyes completely shattered, brimming with unshed tears that she was fighting with every ounce of her remaining strength. Without hesitating, I pulled her against my chest. Camilla resisted for a fraction of a second, her body instinctively fighting the vulnerability, before she completely surrendered. She buried her face into the curve of my neck, right next to the diamond choker, her hands gripping the silk of my dress as if I were the only solid thing left in a falling world. I wrapped my arms around her white tuxedo, holding her tight, resting my chin against her soft blonde hair. I could feel the frantic, terrifying beat of her heart against my ribs. "You're okay," I whispered into the quiet, insulated cabin of the car, my hand gently stroking her back. "I've got you. You did it. You're out." She didn't speak. She just clung to me tighter, the scent of crushed bergamot wrapping around us in the dark. The drive back to the penthouse was a silent, exhausted blur. By the time the private elevator doors opened into the sprawling, monochrome living room, the city below was sleeping, casting long, lonely shadows across the marble floor. Camilla looked completely drained. The white tuxedo, once a symbol of her flawless armor, now just looked like a heavy, suffocating constraint. "Go to sleep, Camilla," I said softly, picking up her dropped clutch from the glass console. "I'll be in the guest wing if you need me." I turned to walk down the dark corridor, fully expecting her to retreat into her isolation. The contract was maintained, the job was done for the night. But as I took my first step, a hand caught my wrist. I stopped, the silk of my gown swishing softly in the quiet room. I looked back. Camilla was standing there, the city lights illuminating half of her face. Her grip on my wrist was surprisingly strong, but her fingers were tracing the delicate pulse point of my skin. She looked up at me, the shattered vulnerability replaced by a deep, dark, and incredibly dangerous hunger. "You didn't take the check," Camilla whispered, her voice a raspy, intimate scrape in the silence. "I told you," I murmured, my heart rate accelerating despite my absolute best efforts to remain professional. "You already bought my month." Camilla took a slow step closer. The space between us evaporated again. She didn't let go of my wrist. Instead, her other hand reached up, her knuckles gently brushing against the crimson silk of my bodice. "I don't want you in the guest wing tonight," the Ice Queen commanded softly, her glacial eyes dropping to my lips. She tugged my wrist, pulling me a fraction of an inch closer until I could feel the heat radiating from her skin. "Where do you want me?" I breathed, the cynical escort completely fading, leaving only Nadia standing in the dark. Camilla looked up, her gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that threatened to burn the entire penthouse down. "In my room," she whispered, "with me." "In my room," the Ice Queen whispered, "with me." The words hung in the quiet, moonlit space of the penthouse living room, heavy with 1,000 unspoken implications. My heart, a cynical, battle-hardened organ that I had trained for years to feel absolutely nothing on the job, suddenly hammered violently against my ribs. I had crossed a threshold the moment I pushed that check back across Richard Vance's mahogany desk. But stepping into Camilla Vance's master suite, that wasn't just crossing a line, that was setting the map on fire. She didn't let go of my wrist. She turned, leading me down the dark, shadowed corridor away from the guest wing. Her grip was firm, yet there was a desperate, grounding need in the way her fingers pressed against my pulse. We reached the end of the hall. The heavy, double doors of the master suite stood before us, the one place in this $40 million fortress she had explicitly declared off-limits. Camilla pushed the door open, pulling me inside, and kicked it shut behind us. The room was massive, bathed entirely in the silver glow of the city lights pouring in through the panoramic windows. But unlike the sterile, museum-like quality of the rest of the penthouse, this room held fragments of a soul. There was a vintage record player in the corner, a stack of worn, leather-bound books on the nightstand, and the massive, king-sized bed looked soft, inviting, and incredibly lived in. This was where the Ice Queen took off her crown. Camila let go of my wrist and walked to the center of the room. She stood with her back to me, her shoulders suddenly slumping, the adrenaline of the gala completely leaving her system. She looked impossibly small in that oversized, pristine white tuxedo. "I have never brought anyone in here," Camila said, her voice barely a whisper floating in the quiet space between us. "I know," I murmured. I walked slowly toward her, the deep burgundy silk of my gown whispering against the thick carpet. I stopped just inches behind her. The scent of crushed bergamot and dark cedar was intoxicating, wrapping around my senses. I reached out, my hands gently resting on the broad, tailored shoulders of her white jacket. I felt her breath hitch, a full-body shiver traveling down her spine at my touch. "The performance is over, Camila," I whispered, my voice dropping into a low, intimate hum. "You don't need to wear the armor anymore." Slowly, deliberately, I slid my hands down her arms, gripping the lapels of the tuxedo jacket. With a gentle, coaxing pull, I slid the heavy white fabric off her shoulders. It fell to the floor in a discarded heap, a visual surrender of the Vance legacy. She was left in a crisp, white silk button-down shirt, completely untucked, her suspenders hanging loosely at her sides. Camila finally turned around to face me. The moonlight caught the sharp angles of her jaw and the incredibly vulnerable, fractured look in her glacial blue eyes. She wasn't looking at me like an employee. She was looking at me like a lifeline. Her eyes dropped to the heavy, staggering diamond choker wrapped around my neck. Her elegant fingers reached up, brushing against the warm skin of my collarbone as she found the intricate clasp. "You defended me," Camila breathed, her voice trembling slightly as she unhooked the diamonds. The heavy necklace slipped from my throat, discarded onto a nearby velvet chair. "My entire life, people have only ever stood beside me to see what they could take from my father's table. But you stood in front of me." "I told you," I said, my voice softening as I looked up into her mesmerizing eyes. "I'm not a variable in his equation." Camila's hands didn't drop. Instead, they slid from my collarbone to the bare skin of my shoulders, her thumbs lightly tracing the edge of the deep crimson silk. The heat radiating between us was undeniable. It was a gravitational pull, heavy and intoxicating. "Why didn't you take the check, Nadia?" she whispered, her gaze dropping to my lips. It was the question that was tearing her apart. The billionaire heiress who believed everything had a price was staring at the one thing she couldn't calculate: asp. I stepped closer, erasing the final fraction of space between us. My chest brushed against hers. I could feel the frantic, rapid beating of her heart matching the erratic rhythm of my own. "Because, Camila," I murmured, my hands coming up to cup her face, my thumbs gently sweeping over her sharp cheekbones. "Some things are worth infinitely more than 6 zeros." The last remnants of the Ice Queen's control completely shattered. With a soft, desperate sound, Camila leaned down and crashed her lips against mine. There were no cameras here, no reporters, no fathers to perform for. This wasn't a calculated, possessive mark left on a red carpet to prove a point. This was raw, starving, and incredibly real. Her mouth was hot and demanding, a chaotic mix of desperation and deep, unspoken longing. I kissed her back with equal ferocity, parting my lips to let her in, entirely losing myself in the taste of her expensive whiskey and something entirely, uniquely Camila. My hands tangled in her pale blonde hair, ruining the flawless, wealthy styling, pulling her closer until there was absolutely no air left between us. Camila's arms wrapped tightly around my waist, her strong hands gripping the silk of my dress, lifting me slightly off the floor as she backed me up against the edge of the massive bed. The kiss slowed, shifting from a frantic collision to a deep, agonizingly slow exploration. She kissed me like she was trying to memorize the feeling, her lips trailing from my mouth, along my jaw, and down the long column of my neck. I tilted my head back, a soft, involuntary gasp escaping my lips as her teeth lightly grazed my pulse point. "Nadia," she breathed against my skin, her voice thick with desire, the vibration sending waves of heat straight to my core. "I'm here," I whispered, my fingers deftly working the top buttons of her white silk shirt. "I'm right here." The heavy, complicated layers of our lives, the debts, the empires, the underground clubs, and the boardrooms, all dissolved into the shadows of the bedroom. For the rest of the night, there was only the slide of silk against skin, the intoxicating heat of tangled limbs, and the quiet, desperate confessions whispered in the dark. I mapped every inch of the billionaire's hidden vulnerabilities, breaking down the last of her walls with slow, reverent touches until the Ice Queen completely melted in my arms. When I woke up, the room was bathed in the soft, golden light of dawn. I was tangled in incredibly soft Egyptian cotton sheets. Camilla was lying beside me, her head resting on my chest, her arm draped protected across my waist. In the morning light, with her blonde hair messy and her face completely relaxed in sleep, she didn't look like a terrifying CEO. She just looked beautiful, and soft, and mine. A dangerous, unfamiliar warmth bloomed in my chest. "I'm in trouble," the cynical escort in my head whispered. "You broke rule number 2. You fell for the client." I gently brushed a stray curl from her forehead, trying not to wake her. I needed to think. I needed to figure out how to navigate a contract that had just become terrifyingly real. But before I could untangle myself from her embrace, a harsh, mechanical buzzing shattered the morning peace. I froze. Camilla shifted slightly in her sleep, burying her face deeper into the crook of my neck. Carefully, I reached over her, grabbing my phone from where I had discarded my clutch on the floor last night. The caller ID made the blood in my veins run completely cold. It was Marcus, the manager of the Obsidian. I slid out of bed, grabbing the discarded white tuxedo shirt from the floor and pulling it over my bare shoulders. I walked into the adjoining master bathroom, shutting the door quietly before answering the call. "Marcus," I whispered, keeping my voice low. "It's 6 a.m. What's wrong?" "Nadia, where are you?" Marcus's voice wasn't just nervous, it was completely panicked. I could hear the sound of things being thrown around in the background. "I'm at the Vance penthouse." "Why? What's going on?" "You need to get out of there. Now," Marcus hissed, his breath ragged. "Whatever you and that heiress pulled at the gala last night, it made the morning news. The whole city is talking about the Vance daughter and her mystery woman." "That was the plan, Marcus," I said, a knot of dread forming in my stomach. "No, you don't understand," Marcus interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "Richard Vance's fixers were here an hour ago. They didn't just ask questions. They dug into your background. They know who you are, Nadia. They know about your real name. And worse, they know about your father's debt." The marble floor beneath my bare feet suddenly felt like ice. "The loan sharks," Marcus continued, the panic fully taking over. "Vance bought your debt, Nadia. He bought the paper, and he just called it all in. If you don't walk away from Camilla Vance today, they are coming for you, and they are going to take everything." I stood in the luxurious marble bathroom, wearing the billionaire's shirt, staring at my pale reflection in the mirror. Richard Vance couldn't buy me out, so he decided to destroy me instead. And the worst part was, if I wanted to survive, I was going to have to break the Ice Queen's heart.